Hello, everybody. President Sunday here. I'm joined once again by Professor Matt McManus. And as you can tell from the title, we are talking about Hannah Arendt, the 20th century political theorist and philosopher, classicist. I'm not sure what else you would call her. But she wrote fairly voluminously, so it's a bit of a mystery as to where we should actually start. So, Professor McManus, you've actually been...
Hello, everybody. President Sunday here.
And I swear I'm going to do that every single time I do a stream. So, Professor McManus, you've been teaching a course on Arendt, or at the very least, you've been covering Arendt.
We touch on her for several lectures in my class on classical political thought.
Yeah, so obviously she herself obviously is not a classical political theorist, but she is heavily oriented towards studying the classics of political thought. I think in particular Aristotle and Augustine come to mind, absolutely. And then some more obscure other classicists, I think specifically of Numa Denise Fustel de Collage, whose book The Ancient City is fantastic. I highly recommend it, and it is on my Discord if anyone wants to take a look at it. But you can find it online for free pretty easily. And I guess to open up, just sort of to relate it directly to your more recent work, Professor McManus, there is a way in which Arendt can be read, being very loose with their terms, of course, as herself almost a kind of reactionary. There's certainly a very conservative spirit to a lot of her work. And there's certainly a lot of nostalgia. Now, granted, that's nostalgia for something that very few people, very few conservatives tend to emphasize, or maybe I'm mistaken in that. But I don't know, perhaps you had some thoughts related to that, or we can go however you want to go with this. You are the expert.
Yeah, no, I think that there definitely is a conservative interpretation to her work that you could give, which was extremely credible, right? And people have been doing that for quite some time, and she's been an influence on a variety of different conservative figures. Patrick Deneen comes to mind as perhaps the most contemporary one. But, the reason is, of course, as you pointed out, that, there's two things. One is that there's a hefty dose of nostalgia to her work. People or figures like Heidegger, who is a big influence on her, she tends to see modernity or the modern world as deficient in many specifics, right? And consequently, she tends to spend a great deal of time analyzing the classics, particularly the classics of Greek philosophy, trying to figure out, if you want to put it really simply, where things went wrong, right? Where modernity took the bad turn towards loneliness, totalitarianism, and so on. And of course, anything that looks backwards in this kind of way for inspiration runs the risk, or is open at the very least, to a conservative interpretation, right? The other reason why people on the right tend to be attracted to her, for a wide variety of reasons, is because she tended to be highly critical of Marxism or any other iteration of egalitarian theories, any other iteration of egalitarian justice that happened to be popular at the time. And one of the things that you see in her book, The Human Condition, is she tries to develop a notably non-Marxist account of labor, what distinguishes the labor of modernity from laboring or working or being active in the classical period. And this decision not to engage with Marx or any other egalitarian theory, what do you think of socialism or narco-syndicalism or what have you, was to a certain extent the product of a certain elite upbringing, right? She didn't really like a lot of these movements temperamentally or in terms of their practical politics. And whether or not that she was right to do so, or whether or not there might be some way of reconciling her work with a more egalitarian spirit, is something that we can talk about. But certainly she was always a little bit skeptical in that regard.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that too, especially with her book on violence in particular. You see that come out? Very worth reading, and I definitely don't want to disparage her by making the comparison, but there is almost a bit of the tone of like an Alan Bloom there, with respect to and I mean, to be fair, like a lot of the time there is something to the case to be made that at sort of the ground level there is a bit of an intellectual impoverishment with activist culture. But that being said, she's also, especially what you will see in her book on revolution, she's not she's not anti-revolutionary either. In fact, she seems to valorize a specific kind of revolutionary sentiment, if I'm reading her correctly. I think in particular her praise of the Paris Commune. I think it's been a while, but if I remember the book correctly, she does juxtapose the American Revolution with. Does she juxtapose the Russian Revolution at all in that book, or is it just the French and the American?
Yeah, she does a couple of different comparisons between various revolutionary periods. Almost all, I should say, within a European context. But I think that your comment is exactly right. I mean, for all that one could give a conservative reading on Hannah Arendt, one can also give a decidedly non-conservative reading of her work as well. And I think in some senses, this is also a more organic reading, since, of course, she was a staunch critic of many of the different reactionary movements in her day, particularly Nazism, right, for which she's most famous. And she denigrated things that many conservatives today tend to valorize, nationalism probably being the most noteworthy, traditionalism being another characteristic feature of conservative movements that she didn't really have much truck with. She was exceptionally critical of the argument that what you need is a shared cultural identity that's going to hold people together. And in some senses, this isn't surprising. What she was castigating both the right and the left for was putting the interest of the thinking or the reflective individual, which I should point out is very different than the kind of atomized liberal individual. So the thinking and reflective individual should not be subordinated to the group under any kind of circumstances, right? And conservatives are just as prone to doing that, or if not more so in many circumstances, she thought, as people on the left. People on the left tend to subordinate people on the basis of their class situatedness, right? Marxism probably being, at least in her interpretation, a paradigmatic example. But conservatism likes to subordinate people on the basis of their ethnicity, their culture, the traditions that they hold to, their race, most notably, early in the 20th century. And she had very little time for any of that.
Yeah. No, she does, of course, her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, of course, doesn't implicate strictly conservatism. It does strongly implicate conservatism, but the trajectory is not a simple linear one from conservatism to totalitarianism. Do you have any? Again, it's been in excess of a decade since I read the book, but do you have any recollection, or obviously you've been teaching it? Can you tell us what is the relationship between conservatism and these totalitarian movements? And I think that word movement is very important here, because conservatism isn't in and of itself quite of a kind, on my understanding at least, with Nazism, with Stalinism, what have you. Yeah, please.
Well, here I think we have to be very careful, right? Like, she's not talking about your run-of-the-mill Stephen Harper or Ronald Reagan conservative, right? She's talking about strongly reactionary viewpoints that correspond to this violent decision to reject modernity, right? And I'll get into that in a few seconds. But in The Origins of Totalitarianism, she tries to trace why it is that these very insidious movements emerged back quite some ways. And one of the things that she points out is that people have been very quick to jump to European civilization's defense at every opportunity. And points, this takes the form of even militant assertions of European superiority to the rest of the world, right? And she says, if you look at the consequence of that, it's completely traumatic and disastrous, right? Because the origins of totalitarianism can be found, first off, in the imperial projects that many Europeans carried out on a truly vast scale across the globe, which were where many of the techniques that the totalitarians would later use against European citizens themselves became refined and perfected. The most obvious being the concentration camps that the British, for example, used amongst other European powers in an African context, right? And then, of course, you have the long history of racism that European civilization perfected and gave a kind of scientific or pseudoscientific gloss starting in the 19th century with people like Arthur de Gobineau. And this was another way, of course, of asserting the superiority of their way of life over others, with the irony being, of course, that eventually Nazism turn that race science against other European peoples, subordinating Slavs to the master race, that is the Germans, subordinating Jews, many of whom had lived in Europe for millennia, to the Nords or Anglo-Saxon civilizations, you name it, right? Now, if that was all that she had said, though, I don't think that her work would be remembered the way that it does, because the argument that imperialism and anti-Semitism, you could say racialism more generally, contributed to the emergence of totalitarianism is, of course, true, but not necessarily all that interesting. Where she's really thoughtful and very thought-provoking is her comment in the concluding chapter of the book that ultimately it's loneliness, and a very peculiarly modern kind of loneliness, abets the emergence of these totalitarian reactionary impulses. What you find in individuals in a modern context is they live in a hyper-competitive society where they're always told that being the best, being on top is the most important thing. But of course, in our modern societies, not everyone can be at the top. In fact, most of us won't be, right? Most of us will be, if you want to use a Marxist term, the proles, right? Situated at the bottom. And the irony of modern civilization, of course, is that unlike in earlier periods, for instance, the feudal era, where at least you could say, well, it's God put me here in this situation as a subordinate. It's not my fault. This is the order of things. The kind of ideology of our time insists that if you're at the bottom, that's where you deserve to be. We're in a Darwinian or socially Darwinian community, and you just couldn't cut it, right? And the effect of this, of course, is people who lose the competition feel a tremendous sense of powerlessness and anger, and they also feel tremendously lonely, right? And this, I think, was very insightful, because if you live in a highly competitive society where everyone is out to get you, of course, you're not going to find meaningful attachments with others. And one of the things that she says is you take angry, resentful, lonely people of the sort she saw, for instance, in Berlin or other parts of Germany in the 1920s, and you give them a leader who says, I will give you a sense of meaning and purpose and direction that you will share together. And that meaning is going to be destroying all those who took the power that belongs to you and that's rightfully yours. That's, of course, an extremely appealing message. All you have to do, of course, is surrender your individuality in that context to the leader or to the party. And I thought this was an extremely insightful account of how it is that totalitarianism operates. There are problems here and there, and we can talk a bit about that if you want. But certainly, I think any kind of argument about reactionary movements and totalitarianism that doesn't take loneliness into account as a significant feature isn't really worth trucking with.
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree with that. I mean, generally, political reaction is it almost invariably, maybe it does invariably. Its motivation is a sense of profound loss. Now, what's interesting is that it's often the profound loss of something that was never really there, at least certainly not in the lifetimes of the people who are feeling that loss. So it's, of course, entirely conjectured. And this kind of actually ties back to Arendt's own nostalgia. And again, it's a nostalgia for something that she, of course, was not around for. Namely, in The Human Condition, she gives this this almost grandiose sort of Aristotelian account of the life of the citizen in a proper sense, in the sense of you are a part of you have sort of this nobility, if you will, and this social reality of being a part of the deliberating process of your city, and furthermore to that, this is almost a surrogate for heroism in many different ways, because obviously most people in that time would not have any sort of recognition outside of obviously their place in their household, what have you, and opportunities for gain are few. So this became, in a sense, it is this citizenship position, and I mean you see this in Aristotle. It assumed an almost a what's the word I want to look for here? It's like it becomes embedded almost in their sense of human teleology. Like you are not fulfilled unless you meet this ideal of acting and being among acting people. So I forget where I was going with that, But we were talking about reaction, right? Okay.
I think there's a profound connection between the typology that you're describing and its kind of historical situatedness and the account of reactionary totalitarianism that she gives in the earlier book, right? Because one of the things that she mentions in the Human Conditions is there's three kinds of active life that people live, right? There's the work of labor, and labor is almost entirely oriented around the satisfaction of subjective needs, right? I labor in order to provide myself with food or provide myself with a house or to put clothes on my back. To some extent, you might say to feed my children or those immediately around me, right? But it doesn't engage me with the world all that much. And more importantly, it doesn't require me to interact that much with others to construct a world that we share together. And this is a recurring theme that she develops throughout her book, right? Which is that, we don't just develop our sense of the world independent of others. And this is really the Aristotelian influence that you're talking about, right? We construct our sense of the world together. And if you want an example of this, all you need to do is walk down the street, right? So you walk down the street because you want to go buy like cigarettes or coffee, right? Well, you need to start thinking about yourself. Well, what about the people who are driving at the side of the road? What about that person who's walking nearby me? There's a virus that's going around, and I've been told by the government that it might be advisable to avoid contacting people. Then you interact with the teller and you buy your cigarettes or whatever it happens to be. You give them money. All of this depends on your sharing a conception of the world with other people that they also think is valid, right? And so labor doesn't really tend to incline you to share that much of a sense of the world with others, right? You might engage with them in the kind of instrumental sense that I'm talking about, but it doesn't go much beyond that, right? And the world, in many senses, is defined by people who labor rather than by people who, as we were talking about, engage in what she calls work or engage in action, right? Because work is a project that has an end to it, right? It's not something that I'm doing typically just to satisfy my own independent desires. It's usually something like writing a book, for example, right? Writing a book is work. Because even though I might be doing it in order to satisfy my material needs, there are other people that I need to interact with because there's an end to this project. And to make sure the project reaches its end, I need to coordinate with them. We need to share a conception of what this book is going to be about, where it's going to be published, who the audience is, what the editor is going to do, what I have to do, and all that kind of stuff, right? And then the highest kind of highest kind of active life is action, right? Which is what you're talking about, where we quite literally, in some cases, construct the world together, usually through political deliberation, rather like what you see in ancient Greece, which is the paradigm you referred to, right? Where we all gather together and we deliberate, are we going to pass this law? Will we institute this set of policies? What kind of values are our society going to have? All these things are very much oriented around a specific set of ends, that of having the best possible community. But it's very much a shared set of ends, right? One that we have to cooperate on. And the problem, of course, is this civic life that you found so appealing isn't something that is very characteristic of politics today, right? We don't feel compelled to construct the world together through action, since the only thing we're supposed to be doing is laboring to satisfy our independent desires, right? Which means that we share a very thin concept of the world together. The problem, I think, with her argument, because it's an interesting argument, right? It's I think it's provocative and insightful, is that she dissociates this account of the active life from political economy in any substantial sense of the word. And this isn't some kind of faux pas, right? It's actually quite important. So you take the Athenian or Roman societies that people sometimes hold up as exemplars of civic life, right? You'd literally go to the polis or to the Senate and you'd agitate for your political positions, you form alliances and cooperate with others, right? Where a lot of them were dependent on slave labor, right? To give people the kind of leisure time they required in order not to have to labor, but to focus on just constructing their sense of the word together. But a sense of the world that, of course, worked to the benefit of those who happen to be in charge because they had the labor to actually do this. The leisure to actually do this. Right? And a lot of people have criticized Arendt for this. I'm by no means the first, but I do think it's a pretty serious problem, right? Because unless you can give us some account of how it is that you can create the leisure time for a mass of people to actually engage in the active life of creating a world together. You're not going to get very far beyond various forms of political nostalgism or political utopianism, since the two are often twin cousins.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, she has that very evocative way of characterizing the life of labor, and it's not a direct quote, but it's like it's a metabolic relationship with the world. So you feel hungry, you eat something, eventually you're going to feel hungry again, and like with a piece of work, you finish the work, and then the work has a fixed reality in the world that other people can interact with, and in a way it represents a growth of your own being in the world, and you can enjoy that even for itself. Whereas if you're doing this sort of Sisyphic labor, you're working at the burger joint, and you're going in every single day, you're working for 8 hours doing the same task over and over and over again to make money that disappears, you start to ask questions like, why am I doing this? You start to need meaning for it. Whereas the person who performs work can enjoy the work, or can enjoy the fact of having produced work and having grown in some sense as a result. So I actually tend to agree with you very much. And it's not just, if I can add to that critique, it's not just that it ignores political economy and the need for slave labor. She does account for that, but she doesn't account. In fact, I'm going to build off of what you just said. She doesn't account for the role of that in producing the valorized concept of political life that Aristotle himself bluntly fetishized, because again, he's writing in a very late period after you've had all of these reforms that have made people fall upon this political identity by accident. So I think she is very much, I mean, maybe the best way to view Arendt in this capacity is as sort of a diagnostician from within this kind of methodological, I don't know what you call it, like a methodological politicalism or something, or this assumption of this sort of Athenian model as in some sense identical with the human good, following Aristotle and even then Augustine and whatnot going forward. And I mean, fascinatingly in this respect, maybe, not maybe at all, this is the common heritage of the totalitarian, the liberal, what have you. And they're all just finding themselves in these vastly different spaces, resulting from I guess whatever contradictions between this idiot. I don't work in fast food, by the way, Lux Logos. I work in house cleaning. It's a much more noble endeavor. But yeah, so we're all partaking of this same ideological trajectory, and this loneliness, like it almost seems like the reactionaries, not totalitarians, that's sort of begging too much, but national socialists, what have you, nationalists, they're not just laboring in the capacity of slaves. They're also, the perversity of the modern condition is that they're also acutely aware or embedded in this ideological frame in which being publicly real in the Athenian way is something that either defines success or failure for them. And of course, the vast majority of us fail miserably. And even in politics, as you indicated, like for most people who even work in government, they get less, they have less people hear them as themselves than people like you and me here now in this little dark corner of the internet. So it's yeah.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, one of the things that we can talk about is, again, you work as a cleaner, right? I used to work in fast food. I worked at McDonald's for a little while, and then I worked at a grocery store for years and years. And one of the things about those kinds of labor that anybody who's been in them for any period of time knows is that it's a pretty lonely business, right? You don't really interact with the customers all that much besides instrumental transactions and the occasional person yelling at you. You can't really interact with your coworkers all that often because you don't really share a sense that what you're doing is important. So there's no qualitative commitment to improving together, right? You're just kind of doing this to cash your paycheck and get out, right? And the problem with this, of course, is that we spend a huge amount of our day involved in these kinds of labor, right?
Yeah.
More and more, especially since we're a busier generation than many before. And the difficulty with this is that our psychological sense of who we are, right, and the firmness of our identity is dependent in a very profound sense on the meaningful interactions that we form with other people, right? And this is an insight she takes from, yes, Aristotle, but I also say from somebody like St. Augustine, right? Particularly Augustinian accounts of love, right? You are more real and more you to the extent that you have rich, meaningful relations with other people that you genuinely care about, because that provides you with a sense of what's important beyond yourself and gives you a mission in life, right? Something to prioritize, right? And the problem with modernity, when we're lonely and we don't form these kinds of meaningful attachments in the way that, she thinks that people used to, and I think that's problematic for the reasons I articulated, as of course that people don't have the psychological or personal strength or even the sense of self that's required to resist the temptations and the allure of totalitarianism, right? They're lonely, angry people, and there's not that much more to them than this. And that's not their fault, right? I mean, this is something that you pointed out that I think is very acute, right? She's a diagnostician. She's not sitting there condemning individuals for feeling this way, right? The problem is the temptations that they're exposed to and the fact that they give in to those temptations because they don't have the mental fortitude to resist them, right? And I think this comes out most pronouncedly and most interestingly in her book on Eichmann, right? The Banality of Evil, right? And which is probably easily her most controversial book, I should say. Because one of the things she says about Mike Eichmann is that, and one of the reasons her book was so provocative, beyond the fact that she was accused of blaming the Jewish people for their own destruction, despite being a Jewish commentator on Nazism. And I don't think that's true, and I think it misunderstands the book, but that's neither here nor there. But one of the things that I think was even more provocative, generally speaking, outside of the questions about Jewish nationalism, for many readers, is the fact that you can really relate if you're a middle class, lower middle class, or even lower class individual with Eichmann's ambitions, right? What did he want? He wanted to be a fairly successful middle manager. His ambition was to climb the ladder however he could. He wanted to name drop at parties and talk about how all these important people thought he was doing a great job. He wanted to have, a few nice things in his house and impress his wife. These are all things that most of us in modern society can relate to, right? He just happened to achieve those ambitions for a brief period of time by sending millions upon millions of people to their death thoughtlessly, right? And she points out, and I think this is really important, that trying to understand Eichmann and saying, he did not have the mental fortitude to resist the allures of Nazism is not to forgive him, per se, to try to understand, right? And understanding does not entail forgiveness, and it doesn't entail a lack of responsibility. If anything, it's a very challenging and very important thing to do, especially in our era where condemnation often takes the place of thinking through the actual crises that we find ourselves in.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up forgiveness, because one of the reasons why I think she wouldn't want to force forgiveness is because this is actually the she treats it in some respects as almost a substitute for the kind of free action that's valorized in the Athenian case. Forgiveness is again, it's an act of pure individual choice. Noah Watson asked an interesting question, which I think would be useful because it helps clarify some things. So Noah Watson asks, is it just leisure time that restricts people to nostalgic and utopian politics? It even seems that leisure time can increase these tendencies, and I think this is evident on Twitch politics. I assume, he's talking about the live stream platform, and I say Twitch because these live streams often have people who watch them all day, all week. Did you want to respond to that first? I do have a response myself, but you're my guest.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a very important question, and I think we have to be very careful when kind of treading into those waters. And I actually don't think that she's all that insightful on this point. I think somebody like Theodor Adorno or Max Horkheimer actually has a lot more to say about this, right? Because one of the things that Horkheimer and Adorno point out in their work on the culture industry is that leisure has been broadly misunderstood, or the purpose of leisure has been broadly misunderstood, right? Leisure, particularly as presented to us in the modern world, is allegedly the time period where you do what you want. You satisfy your subjective desires in the most venal way possible, And they said, it's not a surprise that people feel this way. You work 10, 12 hours a day. On the weekend, what do you want to do? You want to sit down in front of the TV, drink a six-pack, and order out so you don't have to make food, and watch the game or watch Netflix or whatever it happens to be, right? Whereas what they said leisure should be used for, of course, is a time to develop a thicker sense of who you are through improving your aptitudes, becoming more of what you fundamentally happen to be, right? When we don't actually have sufficient leisure to engage in such kinds of self-building activities, or while we're not encouraged to use what little leisure time we have to do them, again, you produce a society where people are culturally and individually not prepared to resist the temptations of reactionary politics, right? And the reason, of course, is, if all you're doing is sitting there drinking your six-pack of beer and watching the game, like you said, you're probably going to feel pretty alone. Right. If you share that with other people, that might not necessarily be using your leisure in the venal sense that Adorno and Harkram was talking about. You might be building a community, in which case, you might be doing something akin to what Hannah Arendt was saying you should do. Right. Yeah.
Well, I think it's
fantasy football league or playing sports or whatever it happens to be. Right.
Well, I think it's also it's revealing that when she's taking her idea of the relationship between leisure and sort of I guess eudaimonia or like attaining, sort of maximizing your potential as a human being. She's taking it from Aristotle. The word leisure is, of course, not what Aristotle used. The word that Aristotle used was skole. So it certainly doesn't refer to sitting at home being on Twitch all day long. That's not leisure, and certainly not when you're exhausted. You're not learning in the same way. And furthermore, like, again, it's not just a matter of having more or less free time, even in the venal sense. It also has to do with sort of where you are, what kind of thing you conceive yourself to be, or what kind of thing your society conceives yourself to be, or what kind of avenues for action or growth are actually available to you. I think one of the tragedies of our contemporary condition is that it's not the story of you just go hit the bricks, you go to work at the restaurant, you ask for a job, they give you a job, you work your ass off, you become the head chef. No, it's you go through an impersonal process of applications. You get hired for a menial task with very limited opportunities for growth upwards. Now, there are opportunities to go upwards, but they're few and they're slow and they're unsatisfying. And you have people who, for whatever reason, are ambitious beyond this, or at the very least, for whatever reason, they are pained to be in that situation. And it's not just that people who don't have enough time then are weakened into wanting to follow Hitler or Stalin or what have you. It's that these movements give them a sense of reality and self. Or more accurately, maybe it's they offer them a surrogate for their sense of self that's entirely that they feel to be absent, and that relieves really a kind of suffering. I think the crucial point here is that if she has a critique of nationalism, of political reaction, of certain kinds of nostalgia and romanticism, what have you, it's not because of the specific policies that they do, but because ultimately, again, like Athenian democracy did things as bad as the Hitler regime did, granted not on nearly the same scale, but they purged cities of people all the time. The point, though, is that they chose to do it. If you're motivated primarily to assuage, to cure yourself of pain or to satisfy a hunger, you're not acting freely. You're acting in what Aristotle would call a slavish capacity. It is, in fact, it's a degeneration of the self in a way, a willful one, because it again, you're in pain or you're hungry or what have you. But it certainly doesn't represent an improvement.
No, I think that you're very right about this. And I suppose this is the last point I can make, and then we can take some questions.
Yeah, sure.
This is very nicely articulated in her book, The Life of the Mind. where she actually seems to give the liberal tradition a bit more of a break, possibly because, she was exposed to some of the alternatives and they all appeared worse. But she engages in this very thorough analysis of the work of Immanuel Kant, right? I'm putting it very simply. She says that there's a fundamental difference between being conscious and having thoughts and thinking, right?
Yeah.
Any number of different entities out there are conscious in a very simplistic sense of the word, right? Butterflies, dogs, fish, they're all conscious beings, but it's hard to say that they think in the same sense that a human being does, right? Now, I think she's being a bit elitist there because I imagine elephants and dogs and whales probably do think in a profound sense, but let's just give her, her due for a few seconds, right? The problem with totalitarianism, and we could say to a lesser extent, the problem with nationalism or any kind of reactionary movement is, of course, what these people are saying is don't think, be a conscious being, but surrender your own independent judgments to those of the group, right? Or to the leader in the ultimate sense, right? And what this constitutes is a profound abandonment of the most human characteristic that we have and the most important one, right? Because if you think that you are no longer, if you believe you are no longer responsible for your own thoughts, that only the leader of the group or your tradition or your nation is, then you are utterly unprepared to be a moral agent, right? In the sense that one must be, right? Now, she unfortunately never completed this book. She passed away before it was done. So we have no idea whether she would have been able to find a way to reconcile this Kantian insight about the distinction between being a conscious being and being a thinking person with the kind of Aristotelian outlook she developed in the 1950s. Maybe she would have, maybe she wouldn't have, right? But I think this is very insightful, right? And it teaches you a lot about why she was uncomfortable, and should probably be profoundly uncomfortable with some of these movements that offer you that sense of community that many people long for in modern life. And the reason she say isn't because community is a bad thing. It's because community has to be founded on each person maintaining their individuality, putting forward what they think is the right things to do morally and aesthetically, and not subordinating themselves to the group expectations, right? And that's not what these movements want, right? What these groups want is for you to conform to them and then to label yourself a free thinker, I suppose, who just happens to believe what absolutely everyone else in the group thinks and who hates the same kind of people that they do.
Yeah, and I think we're sort of accustomed to sort of thinking of our status as thinking beings in that same way. Like one of the things that is most frustrating about really talking to anybody who kind of plays into the modern culture war, if you will, that kind of thing, is that they tend to reduce the human intellect to like here's like a form and you can fill it out with different trivial facts. What's your ideology? Let's say, I'm a communist or something like that. What's your religion, or what's your ultimate concern, if you want to be a little bit more nuanced about it? And it's like I even find it with myself with making videos, like the temptation is always there to just sort of produce things that you already know or have read or what have you, or just like things that you piece together very easily, because there's a demand to keep up production. And that can very easily lead to like an atrophy of your ability to read and think, which has been one of the alarming things that happened to me sort of midway through doing this. So, I mean, I think it's a twofold critique she makes. First of all, of the individual who's, it's not entirely their fault to be sure, but of the individual who allows themselves to become susceptible to this kind of thing, and then of a condition more broadly in a cultural sense that primes people so that it's not just likely that they'll fall into this. And in many cases, even when they're reflective, this is the only way of looking at it that's sort of presented to them. So I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to say. We can just go back to questions.
I'll just conclude on this, right? Because what I thought you said is very acute, right? And if you wanted to apply this kind of analysis to a contemporary phenomenon, I don't think that there's anyone that's better suited to it than a lot of the rhetoric you see, for instance, coming out of something like the intellectual dark web with its veneration, so-called reason, logic, and facts, right? If Arendt were alive today, she'd say there's few things more insulting to a thinking person than transforming reason or logic or the facts about the world that we all share, I should say, into slogans, right? Because slogans are not what a thinking person does, right? Slogans are what you do when you surrender your capacity for independent judgment and you just repeat like a tantric mantra what everyone else around you is saying, because you do not want to think for yourself, right? Even if that's, the kind of motto that you happen to be repeating, right? And so the irony of a lot of these kind of reactionary movements, of course, is that under the auspices of trying to protect freedom of speech and protect, critical inquiry and so on, often what they just do is end up rehashing various forms of nationalist collectivism or instrumental capitalism that Hannah Arendt would think were both vulgar and insulting to anybody who genuinely takes it as their task to be a responsible thinker in the 21st century now, right?
Thank you.
That's kind of my take on that.
Well, it's really well put. Yeah, so guys, please ask questions. I think we'll probably go to the end of the hour. I understand you have to go make dinner, but
no, my wife is lecturing today, so I have to. It's my responsibility right now. So
that is perfectly respectable. So let's try and go in order here. Can you discuss more on the differences between leisure and idleness?
Okay. Well, again, idleness just refers again to the gratification of our purely subjective desires, right? And it's not necessarily that being idle or satisfying your subjective desires is always a bad thing, right? You want to have a cigarette, Hannah Arendt smoked all the time. You do that, that might provide you with a certain amount of subjective satisfaction that's legitimate. It's a dangerous thing, and you probably shouldn't do it if you're concerned about your health. But there you go, right? If you decide to have a couple beers and watch the television because you're tired or you've had a long day, in some circumstances, again, that can be an entirely legitimate thing to do, right? Yeah. The problem is when you decide to take any time that's available to you that's not committed to labor and purely spend it in idleness, right? Because what you're doing then is you're not developing the sides to yourself that would allow you to become a richer, more fulfilled person, right? I mean, richer in the internal sense of the world, right? Because the only way that you can do that ultimately is by engaging in leisure that's meaningful. And that usually means, in some sense, leisure that's eventually going to bring you back into the world and force you, in some sense, to interact with other people who share the world with you, right? And, leisure time spent in this way can be done in a lot of different activities, right? One of the, the title is a very well-known sociology book in the early 2000s was Bowling Alone. And the point of the author was that, well, bowling, if you do that with other people, can be an upbuilding activity, right? You share this with other people, you form a sense of community around your sport, right? Poetry slams, they can be a kind of community building activity that can help you develop a more robust sense of self. And the thing about these is oftentimes they don't have the kind of instrumental value that we would associate with pure labor, which is supposed to just be about, again, satisfying our individual needs, or in 21st century context, profiting to the greatest extent possible. Right?
Yeah, and I think just I like the smoking and the drinking point, because I mean, again, just another thing that Arendt was highly emphatic on was the importance of being free as a part of maximizing your humanness. And they're called vices for a reason. You don't do these things exclusively because you really want to be the kind of person who does that. You do that because you've developed a dependence upon them, and now you're less free as a result. Sean,
I should say, just to qualify this a little bit, right? That what we call vices, in some senses, become vices when we're doing it purely to satisfy our subjective desire, from her standpoint, and also if they have negative consequences for our health, which is very important. But take something like the village bar, right? I lived in Ireland for a little while. A lot of people after work would go to the bar and they'd have 3 or 4 drinks together, right? Yeah. And they would talk about each other's day and they would discuss what's going on. This could be a community building activity, right? Because the point wasn't to go and drink the beer. The beer was a kind of excuse to get together and talk with people, right?
Yeah.
And that's very different, of course, than sitting alone at your house, pounding back 5-6 beers by yourself.
Yeah, and I'm
other people. And if you're doing this because you enjoy doing it and you like to see those people and you just need somewhere to go, it's a very different kind of activity.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not disparaging anybody who drinks. I have a cider next to me as we speak.
Yeah.
Sean McManus, who is not our guest, asks, does Arendt offer any solutions? I'm actually curious about this one because I can't recall.
No, I don't think that she really does offer a solution. Certainly not one that would be viable in the political sense of the world, right? I mean, a lot of people have accused her of Polis envy or Polis fetishism. And, these are all kinds of insulting, but the point is that she seems to suggest that, well, the best kind of society would be a 4th century or 3rd century BCE, Athenian democracy. Well, the odds of that happening now in the modern world are slim to none, right?
Yeah.
Now, whether we could come up with something that was equally as participatory, maybe a deliberative e-democracy or what have you, that might be some kind of route that we could go that might satisfy some of these Arendtian insights. But in terms of personally, did she come up with something? I'd say no.
Yeah, I think what she does do is she tries to basically give readers reason for hope. She points to a few things, one of which obviously is emphasized in Origins of Totalitarianism, and that's the idea of natality, and that's that the world is recreated new with every new life. So you never really need to think of it as if like the world is just an ever spiraling maelstrom ending in destruction. There's always new ways of looking at things. There's new chances for allowing people to grow in a non-botched way. And then beyond that, she also, now this is a bit more fuzzy.
I mean, what is it that song went? It's a 90s song, every new beginning is some other beginning's end. The Closing Time, that's the name of it. Yeah.
Oh, why can't I remember that?
It's okay. It's an old song,
Yeah.
Almost as old as me, so.
Yeah, and then sort of continuing something a little bit fuzzier that she sort of gestures to, and I was always perplexed by this because I wasn't sure if she herself was religious or not. I think that's a mystery, but she seems to almost invoke not like religion as such, but she draws again heavily on almost a poetic perspective on religion, so that even in the absence of a community that can allow you to maximize your potential in this Aristotelian sense, you can still have a kind of meaningful relationship with the world, and that's why she emphasizes things like love, for example. She doesn't fetishize the political to an absurd extent, because she also emphasizes the role of, for example, Christianity in showing the importance of private life as well. Because one of the things that also emblemized Athenian democracy was that people neglected their private lives in order to take part, because it itself had its own addictive quality. And as a result, people were often really terrible for the larger part of their lives just to satisfy this addiction. So, yeah, I can't recall if she ever offers anything like a way forward as such, but she definitely offers a way of viewing the world such that it becomes sort of survivable for readers.
Well, I think the point you made there is extremely important, right? And this is an insight she draws from St. Augustine, amongst others, right?
Yeah.
And even a critic who was scathing of Christian doctrine, as Friedrich Nietzsche, right, used to say, and I think quite poignantly, that the one thing you can mark in Christianity's favor is it did force people to deepen themselves as individuals. And this is something that Arendt picks up on from Augustine as well, because he says one of the things that you do, even if you don't believe, even if we say God doesn't exist, if people were dialoguing with God, right, talking to God, then in some senses, what they were doing was reflecting on themselves. They were talking to themselves about themselves, right? And this can be a very narcissistic activity, but it also can be profoundly important, right? Because, and this is something that she points out in the Origin of Totalitarianism, right? There's a difference between being alone and thinking as a private individual, because we all need alone time, right? We need quiet time to reflect upon our lives, what we're doing, whether we're doing the right thing, and feeling lonely, right? And For a religious person, right, who believes in God, of course, they might be alone, but they'll never feel lonely because God is always with them, right?
Yeah.
And they can always dialogue with themselves through God as an intermediary, much like Augustine did, right? And in the more Aristotelian Thomistic sense, of course, as you pointed out, religion can also provide people with a sense of shared value and meaning and community that they commit themselves to, right?
Yeah.
And of course, that's something that's been undermined by modern instrumental rationalism and individualism or hyper-individualism, right? Now,
yeah, please go on.
no, I was going to say, and now I think there's some problems with this kind of analysis, right? But I do think that she's correct that religion provided people with a sense of to get fulfillment in earlier periods of time that they don't necessarily get today, right? And they try to fill that in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that distinction between loneliness and solitude. I mean, one way I think about it is it's like as a child you tend to experience this a lot more, and I think it has to do with, again, very much the poverty of an individual's soul at that point, because you have very little to do with yourself as a child. You tend to either be very social or you need to imagine yourself friends. So children play with action figures. Adults tend not to do this.
Yeah. Or David Foster Wallace put it really well in an interview we did back in the 2000s, right? David Foster Wallace, the author of Infinite Jest and The Broom in the System, right? Where he said, think about the way that they pump music constantly everywhere you go in public, right? Particularly shopping malls. You listen to all that kind of elevator music. That's just crap, right? Or think about how often, I think we can update this, right? People will wander around in the city with their headphones on, right? And he says, what this indicates is an emblematic need for distraction from our own thoughts that's deeply worrying, because it's only when you have a certain level of quiet and solitude, as you put it, that you can really hear yourself think and become reflective about your own thoughts, which is what's required, again, to be a self-conscious individual, right? When you try to drown that all out through the noise, then you're never going to develop the sense of self-consciousness that's required to be a responsible individual. And I think we can see that right now with somebody like Donald Trump, right? Who at one point said he tries this not very hard not to reflect very much on his actions or statements, and that shows, right? In the profound emptiness of his character and the kind of substancelessness of a lot of his rhetoric, right? This is a person who never could sit there and be quiet because you always need to be the center of attention by making as much noise as possible, however possible.
I would like to hope that it's the reverse, at least for him, that this is his public face, and in private he's more of a full person. I'm not optimistic, but who knows?
We can hope. Maybe we're wrong, right? Maybe he sits there and he has deep thoughts late into the night about the responsibility of becoming president. But yeah, it's kind of hard to believe, right?
Yeah. Do you have time for one more question? I don't want to intrude on your time too much.
I do. One more question is fine.
Brilliant. Okay. Noah Watson asked another really good one. So what do you think separates those who turn to postmodern conservatism and those who turn to totalitarianism in response to the lack of identity?
Well, I think that there's quite a big difference, right? And one of the things that I push very strongly against is trying to characterize these figures as fascist or proto-totalitarians or modern totalitarians or what have you. It's not that I can't see or appreciate why there'd be a temptation to do so. But I think that we need to reject the temptation just to see the new through the prism of the old, right? And the difference between these people who are lonely and who turn to totalitarianism and people who turn now to what I call postmodern conservatism is that many of the people who adopt a postmodern conservative perspective are embedded in a very different cultural and media landscape, right? Which is where you see the kind of didacticism of the pastiche-like identity they try to form, so much more on display than what you ever saw even with the fascist movements, right? These people tend to cherry pick all kinds of features of their identity from all over the place and stitch them together in a way that makes extremely little sense. And this isn't something that you saw even earlier totalitarian movements do, because there was still enough of a connection to certain authentic traditionalist forms of life that they could resurrect these as viable identities for people to inhabit, right? Or at least the specter of a radicalized reactionary form of them as an identity for people to inhabit, right?
Is maybe an easier way of understanding this that for totalitarian to be a totalitarian, one needs to have an opportunity presented to them in a specific way. It's not just an ideology that you assume. It's very much, it's not just an ideology. It's also a way of relating to your society. Like you need certain power structures. Yeah, exactly.
I think the big difference also is that in the 1930s, right, there wasn't the disdain for party politics and for defining yourselves in these kind of very party-oriented terms that there is now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in the 1920s and 1930s, people wouldn't have a problem defining themselves as Nazis, right? Or surrendering their will, as Arendt would call it, to the party, right?
Yeah.
The notion that anyone today would sit there and define themselves purely as a Republican or purely as a Canadian conservative or whatever would seem fairly ludicrous to most of us. I mean, you do encounter a few people like that. But that's in part because there's so much skepticism towards party politics, right?
Yeah.
So the kinds of identities that people yearn for or turn to aren't the same, right? And that's a reflection of our changing cultural landscape over the last 80 years or so.
Yeah, and of course, in American and Canadian politics, there isn't really a party to surrender, if you're a Nazi, to surrender your will to. Thank God.
Yes.
That being said, it's been a pleasure, Professor McManus. You're welcome back whenever you like. Thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, and good luck with work, man. I mean, that sounds like a tough job. So
it's got its ups and downs. Anyways, thank you very much. You have a good evening, and thanks to the audience for participating.